Again, welcome to everyone who is joining us for today's session called BYOV and Learn How to Record Better Voiceovers. I am excited to welcome our panel from PBS NewsHour programs. And we have Elise, who is going to be our top moderator, I guess, today. And I'm going to let her introduce the rest of the panel. And thank you again very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, and thanks to STN for having us. So my name is Elise Estrada. I'm the director for PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs. And Marcus, can I ask you to go to the first slide of the presentation? So we can start at the top. Amazing. Cool, thank you so much. And if you are just joining us, please let us know where you are, where you're joining us from, your school, anything fun that you did over the weekend, how you've been enjoying STN. I hope that everybody's been enjoying it. And so for those people who don't know, Student Reporting Labs is a national youth journalism network connected to teachers and students all over the country. And as part of the PBS NewsHour family, we get the opportunity to share student work on the NewsHour and also on local PBS stations. So we're connected to local stations all over the country, and we develop resources for teachers and students that cover journalism, video production, and all sorts of media making. And then our goal is always to create pathways for students to get their work published and be seen by both local and national audiences. So we are so lucky today to be joined by William Brangham. He's a correspondent and producer for the PBS NewsHour in Washington, D.C. And he's also a champion of Student Reporting Labs. And he is just an incredible mentor and coach to so many of our students over the years. So the way that we're going to be running the session today is that we're going to be doing a little bit of a Q&A on the topic of voiceovers. And then we're hoping to have some time to do a little coaching and conversation with a couple of student volunteers who are part of the panel today. And I'll introduce them now, actually, and then I'll reintroduce them later on. So we have Abby from FB Pankow Center in the Detroit area. Say hi, Abby. And then we also have Aaron, who's joining us from Hawaii. He goes to Maui Waina Intermediate. Hey, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so let's get to the topic at hand, because this whole session is going to be about voiceovers, and William is really experienced in that. So before we jump into the Q&A part of it, I wanted to just introduce him and then have him share a little bit about his story and how he got into the field.
Hey, Elise, thank you. And so nice to see everybody here today. Thank you for being here. As Elise was saying, I work at the PBS NewsHour, which, if you don't know, it's a nightly news program. It's an hour-long program. It airs in every city in the country on PBS. We get 1.5 million to 2 million people watch it every night. And we try to cover everything that we think of as important on any given night. So I'm one of the correspondents on the show. So I'm one of the people whose face appears on TV. I do interviews in the studio. I go out in the field and shoot stories. Sometimes those are 3-minute long stories. Sometimes they are multi-6-part series where I travel all over the world. I mean, I have what I like to brag is, I think, one of the best jobs. I get basically paid to go to interesting places and talk to people about their lives. And sometimes I have to do things that are heartbreaking, and you go to places where there are tragedies happening and there's a storm that's destroyed a town or a fire, or you're talking to a family about losing a child to some awful cancer. Sometimes I get to do really exciting things. Last year, I went to Antarctica. I rode a cruise ship from the tip of South America all the way down to Antarctica and got to spend 2 weeks with penguins and whales and the researchers who were studying the glaciers there. And I've sort of done everything in between. Like tonight on the NewsHour, if you turn on, I know you guys are going to be too busy to be watching the news, but if you were, you'd see I interviewed one of the senior executives at General Motors about how they are pushing electric cars, and they think that they're going to be phasing out gas-powered cars and starting to have electric cars as soon as like 10, 15 years from now. So that is my job. And part of that job involves doing what we're talking about here today, which is recording voiceover. And sometimes that is me talking to camera when I'm in the studio and I say, I'm joined today by so-and-so, and he's from General Motors, and he's the senior scientist who studies such and such. But a lot of times it also involves me when I'm traveling and doing stories in the field, is recording the narration for all of that. In fact, the whole reason that I am doing this, the whole reason that I am someone who appears on TV as opposed to someone who is behind the camera, which is what I was for many, many years. I was an associate producer and a field producer and then a producer, is because of my voice. I worked for a guy who, you guys may be familiar with this. You go out and you shoot a story, and sometimes before the actual correspondent records the narration, a producer or someone else will record it. We call it scratch track. And I recorded a bunch of scratch track for this one story. And the guy that I was working for was a very generous mentor of mine. And he said, your voice is so good. You did all the reporting on this. It's ridiculous for me, him, to be putting his voice on it when he didn't go out in the field and do any of the reporting. He said, so you do it. And that was the first time I ever did it. I was incredibly nervous. If I could, I couldn't find a copy of this original piece I did, but if you could hear it, you'd be like, oh my God, that's so bad. It's so awkward sounding and weird. And I sound stilted and strange. And it took me a long time to learn how to do this narration voiceover better. And I think I've gotten better at it, but that was, almost 20 something years ago. So I've had a lot of practice. So that's the basics of this. As Elise said, I really want you guys to ask questions as you go. There's no question that's too silly or stupid. It can be very specific. It can be very broad. Please post your questions as we go along. But first off, let's just talk very briefly about why we do voiceovers, why we do this kind of narration. And this may seem self-evident, but you're basically just telling viewers what they need to know at the moment that they need to know it. I mean, if your piece that you're doing starts with some confusing video of a kid looking into an aquarium and there's a bunch of fish going by, you might feel the need, you got to explain, like, is this a field trip? Is this child want to be a scientist? Is this about a new poisonous fish that an aquarium has just gotten? Like, you need to explain. And unless someone that you've interviewed is going to explain that right away, you have to explain that. And so that is really the whole thrust of what narration is for, is to explain the parts you need to explain when you need to explain them. It is connective tissue. It helps move from one thing to another. If you want to switch from that aquarium to go meet one of the scientists who brought that unique poisonous fish to the aquarium, you might need to say, so-and-so, Dr. Jane Schmuckety Schmuckety is the scientist who first did this, and you might introduce something about her life. You're basically holding a viewer's hand as they go through it so that things don't confuse them. I mean, that's really in the essence of it, of what you're trying to do. Is anytime a viewer is watching something that you have produced or listening to something that you've produced, and they stop and say, wait, that doesn't make any sense to me. Hold on, why is that happening there? In some way, you've failed to recognize that that's something that people are going to be thinking about. You try to anticipate that all the time. What does someone need to know right now? What is something they can, I don't have to tell them right now. I could tell them a minute from now or 30 seconds from now or never. Those are the decisions you always have to make when you're writing your scripts and when you're delivering them. So
yeah, and William, so something that I've experienced, and I think anybody who's ever done a voiceover has, is that it's not as easy as it seems, and it can be intimidating, right? Especially if you have to think about all of those things that you just mentioned. And so I know that whenever the Student Reporting Labs has a student produced or student co-produced piece on the NewsHour, we end up doing a lot of work with the student correspondent, because that's like we have to meet the NewsHour standard, and it's hard, especially if you haven't been doing it for many, many years. So I love that you're saying, you have to really think about all of these things even before you do your actual voiceover. But if we can actually go to the next slide, I have another question for you. So how did you start off? Well, first of all, you have to explain these photos. But then, you mentioned a little bit earlier about the first time that you ever had to do a voiceover, but how did you get comfortable doing it? Because I think like that's the fear that I hope students get over. And I don't think it's easy, but how do you feel more confident over the years? Like, how did you get comfortable doing it?
Right. It is a huge, I mean, you've all experienced this, I'm sure. The first time you recorded something into a microphone and then played it back for yourself, it always makes, it's like, ugh, I hate the sound of my voice. Everybody has that experience. It's totally natural. If you love the sound of your voice, the first time you hear it played back to you, there's maybe something a little cuckoo going on. It's a very normal reaction to think, I don't like the way my voice sounds. It's just because when we're talking, you don't really hear your voice the same way as when it's played back to you. So it does take a long time to get used to that. Let me just quickly explain what these two photographs are. That is me this morning on the left. That's me in my ultra high tech voiceover record booth in my bedroom upstairs. Like everyone in the quarantine, I've been working at home since last year with a few trips out, but not many. That's me recording some narration for a long documentary we're doing for PBS. And the reason I chose the closet is because I can close the door. There's clothes everywhere, which offers a nice sound buffer. And you can see me there. That's me reading my script. You can see that fuzzy thing. That's my microphone, this thing just sitting there pointing at my face. The reason I use this, you may all have seen these things. This protects from wind or sometimes the breath of your peas popping, that can take some of that off. But you see in the next picture over, because it's so fuzzy and kind of teddy bear like, my cat, every time I set it down, she likes to snuggle up next to it. I don't know if she thinks it's a kitten or something, but she likes to rest next to it and sometimes gets mad at me when I take it away because I'm saying I got to work. Anyway, so the way to get over the awkwardness and the uncomfortableness is just by practice. You just have to do it, and you have to record your voice, reading words that feel natural, that feel right to you, playing them back, and sometimes even playing them for other people. Because as I was saying before, it's really important that you put yourself in the mind of the listener. You've done all the reporting, you know this story incredibly well. You have all this information that you want to convey to your listener in whatever format that is. You have to remember that they don't know all those things that you know. You need to figure out, what am I first going to tell them, then what comes next, then what comes next, the sequencing of that, and the type of information you explain. I mean, I do a lot of science reporting, and for many years, I always debated, every time I did a story about climate change, and I would mention something about greenhouse gases or the greenhouse effect. That was maybe you all know what that is, not everybody does, but that was one of those examples where I was constantly stopping and saying to my colleagues, do I need to stop here and explain what we mean when we say the greenhouse effect? And that's something you have to be doing all of the time, is stopping and saying, does everyone get what I'm talking about here? And so that process of learning both how to convey information, but also learning how to be comfortable with your own voice and the sound of your voice, and being comfortable using the different pitches in your voice and the tone of your voice, and slowing down when you really want to emphasize something, or speeding up when you just feel like you got to get through it and you got to move on to the next point. Like, those things are important to learn how to do. And it's like playing a musical instrument. You just get better at it with a lot of practice. So it's not the easiest thing. I know it's awkward. I know, I mean, honestly, if you listen to the first thing that I ever did, which was actually broadcast on national television, horrifying, sounds so stilted to me. And I listen to it and I'm just like, oh gosh, it took me many, many years to feel like, okay, I got this. I'm doing better at this. I'm hitting my stride. So it's totally normal to feel awkward about it. It takes a while.
Yeah, and I feel like there's also a myth that voiceovers have to sound like something specific. Like you have to think about the people who do voiceovers for movie trailers, or like the typical broadcast correspondent. Like there's even, I think, like a lot of TikToks now that I see of like, I'm going to order breakfast in my broadcast voice.
Right.
But is that actually true, or can people now, especially because there's so many different kinds of mediums and ways that we listen to information and news, can people feel more comfortable just having their voice just be what it is?
I would argue yes. It's such a good question, Elise. And I don't know if you've seen these videos. They are really funny where broadcast people will like go into their kitchen and say, here's how I'm making breakfast for my child. First, she likes scrambled eggs and then a little bit of toast with a little side of butter. I think if you are that person, if you are one person when you talk normally to your family, and then you're a different person when you're recording yourself, I think that that's a sign that something is not right. Because and I know I'm somewhat alone in this. There are a lot of people who think that you are supposed to deliver in a certain way. I disagree with that. I think that the whole goal is you're trying to communicate. And the best way that you can communicate is to talk like a normal person. I mean, the highest compliment that I pay to people when I'm looking to interview people for the news hour, these are like a politician, a researcher, an author who we're going to have on the program. If I'm talking to them and they can explain things and I say they sound like a real person, that to me is the highest praise. Like, I don't want someone who puts on an air. I don't like listening to news stories where if that person talked to me the way they're talking on television, I would feel like that was crazy. And so sometimes, I mean, again, if you listen to the stories that I do, it's not totally how I'm talking today. I'm being much more informal than I would be in a written script, but not that much more informal. I do think it's more important to be yourself in many ways. I think your scripts will be better. The way your voice comes out of your mouth will sound better. If you write really complicated sentences full of lots of clauses and you're trying to impress your English teacher and sound like a modern day Shakespeare, it's going to sound false. And the whole point, as I keep saying, is you're trying to convey to people something that you have learned. You've gone out in the world and you've talked to a bunch of researchers who are studying something. You've been to a new church that they're building in your community after it burned down, and a whole bunch of people got together to help rebuild it. You've learned something about what that community went through, and now you're trying to convey that. You don't need to put an artificial sounding voice or overly complicated words between you and the viewer. That's I would argue the opposite of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and one more question related to this point, and it's about the importance of diversity in the industry and diversity of perspective. So I think that there used to be a stigma if your voice didn't sound a certain way, whether you're male or female. Can you talk a little bit about whether you've seen that change in your own experience in the field?
Yeah, it's changing. It's not changing enough, I would argue. I think we are still missing huge swaths of people, both appearing on camera, both brought in as quote unquote experts or voices of authority. It's getting better, but it's not nearly happening fast enough, I would argue. And part of the reason, as you're saying, Elise, is that we traditionally have thought that there is a way, like when I was a kid, the only people you saw delivering the news, to just use one format, were like stiff white guys like me, with a tie, and they talked to you today in Tacoma, Washington. You'd have this very serious thunderstorm and 14 inches of rain. We go now to our correspondent in Shreveport. Like that was what was considered the bar for entry. And it took a long time just for women to appear, let alone people of color, let alone people who didn't all go to college or didn't all have parents with a lot of money. I mean, it was a slow process. And I know that there has been a lot of prejudice against people whose voices sound different than that thing I was just making fun of. So, I mean, several of my colleagues, I could guarantee if I put a blindfold on you and you could see them, I mean, not see them, but hear them on television, you would immediately know that they come from different places in the country. They have different colored skin than me. And that is to be celebrated and to be encouraged, not to be something that in the past would have kept them out of this business. So it's changing, but it's not changing fast enough, I would argue.
Right. Yeah. So we have a question from the audience, and so I'll say the question, and then we should go to your first example of something that you think is a good example of a voiceover. So the question is from Emily Kaufman, and she is asking, when making a news segment, is it okay to start off with a voiceover versus a stand-up? Like, does one catch the audience's attention better than the other?
I think, yes, there are no hard and fast rules. In fact, I think I've probably done, I don't know, several hundred pieces in my life easily. Only once have I ever started with a stand-up. I think generally speaking, this is a visual medium. If we're talking about video, start with great picture, start not even necessarily with your voice, start with the sound of someone else talking. If someone is saying something really interesting that might catch people's attention and make them think, huh, what's going on there? I'm interested. Now I've got them interested. So yeah, you can start with a voiceover, you can start with someone's sound. Again, I think stand-ups are kind of unusual to start with. It can happen, but it's generally speaking, I think, use your best, most interesting stuff, like get people intrigued, open up the story quickly and get the storytelling going quickly. And a lot of times that's not me standing in front of a camera. So here's an example of a story that I did a few days ago. We were talking about the coronavirus, which I've done a ton of reporting on for the NewsHour. And there are these recent things that have been emerging called variants, which are the coronavirus is constantly evolving, and most of the time those changes don't matter at all. Some of these new changes have now made this so that what they call a variant can be more contagious, so it's much easier to get infected with it, and some of them can even make you sicker. And so I did a story about how you go about how best to protect yourself from this. And so right at the beginning, I just wanted to give a good, clear explanation to remind people of how the coronavirus gets passed from one person to another. So let's just play this one clip and you can hear. I think it's muted.
New cells. The first thing to remember is these new variants, just like the initial coronavirus they come from, travel through the air. That's the main way people get sick. Someone who's infected breathes out the virus, and someone who's healthy breathes it in. Dr. Lindsay Marr at Virginia Tech studies airborne transmission, and she says the coronavirus can travel on small airborne droplets or even smaller aerosols.
So that's an example where I really believe you have to be writing to the picture, meaning you have to be thinking about what your viewer is going to see when you're talking. Those cannot be divorced from each other. And so that graphic that we had built, I wrote very specifically because I wanted to remind people this is the most basic thing to understand about how the coronavirus goes from one person to another. When I'm sick and I breathe out or sing or shout or sneeze or whatever, the virus comes out of my mouth and someone who's healthy breathes that in. And so that language that I wrote very specifically was written so that I know we would build a graphic to do that. And so if I had been showing picture in that example of people walking on the street, I wouldn't have written those same words. I would have written them very differently. I would have written something like, when you're walking down the street and people are talking or breathing out, the virus from an infected person comes out of their mouth and can be breathed in by someone else, because it's a different kind of picture. So you always have to be thinking about, what are people looking at? What do I need to explain? How can my words complement the picture and not fight the picture? Does that make sense? So, in fact, there's one other example here that we can show.
The first.
Oh, yeah. Oh, here we go. All right. So I'm going to, yeah, Marcus, if you can stop sharing and then I'll share my screen. And can you set this one up, William?
Yeah, so this is a series that we've been doing about the difficulties people have when they're getting out of prison. And we've talked about how hard it is for mothers being separated from their kids when they're in prison, how hard it is trying to find a job when you get out of prison, when you've got to declare on a lot of forms in a lot of states that you're a felon. This is a story that's it was supposed to be airing tonight, but it's actually airing tomorrow night. So sneak peek, you're seeing something no one else in the country has seen, but millions will
That's
see it
amazing.
tomorrow. Very exciting. So this is a story about a guy, about how difficult it is and how crucial it is to have a driver's license. So this is the very beginning of the piece. And again, listen to the words that I'm saying here, and let's play it first, and then we can talk about it afterwards.
Okay.
9 bars for armed robbery. In September, Kenneth Taylor became a free man. Free from jail, yes, but stuck in limbo.
I feel invisible. I do.
Why? Because Taylor left a Louisiana prison without any form of valid identification. No social security card, no birth certificate, no way to prove who he actually was.
It's crazy. Nobody know I exist right now.
I remember this picture vividly.
He's been out for more than 4 months like this. His son, Ken Mackey, and lawyers at a local New Orleans nonprofit are still helping him piece his life back together, one document at a time.
It's been just obstacle after obstacle trying to, get his ID, his social security card, and birth certificate.
They've been in frequent contact with Louisiana's Department of Corrections trying to get this fixed.
They attempted to send me a birth certificate and a social security card, which was totally not me.
They send you identifications that they thought were supposed to be yours and they were not yours?
They were not mine.
Taylor later received his
So we can stop it there.
That'll help.
So again, a couple of things that I just want to draw your attention to. A lot of the words that I said there were not complete sentences. That is something that, like, if you go to journalism school, you don't always get taught that it's okay sometimes to be more conversational. I try to play off the things that he's saying so that the first time he speaks, very early on in the piece, he says, "I feel like I'm invisible." The next thing that I say is, why? Because blah, blah, blah. I'm directly playing off what he has said. Also, I'm leaning on the picture to explain a little bit about him. Like, if I were to ask you to describe this guy, you would know without me having to have said so that he is a middle-aged Black man, that he's in a scene with his son flipping through photographs. Those are things that if I were doing this for radio, I would all have to explain to you. So I'm letting the picture tell part of the story as it goes, let my words tell another part of it, but make sure that those two things don't fight each other. So it's, again, being conversational, helping people move along in the story, learning to care about this guy. A man who's been in prison for 20-something years comes out and says he feels invisible. To me, that I was a little moved by that. I like this guy. I want to hear what's happening to him. So again, it's just finding a way to start telling a story, to start explaining what people need to know. Again, I don't need to tell you all the other things that you're going to learn later in the piece about how many prisoners come out of prison with no legitimate documentation, or why that makes it hard to get a job, or to get food stamps, or to get an apartment, or even to get custody of your child back again. So all of those things are going to happen later. I could say them all right at the top, but it might be kind of boring. I'd rather you meet someone, feel something about that man, and then we're going to learn more about his story, and I'll unfold that as we go. So just to echo these points that I'm saying, I don't think you always have to be speaking in complete sentences. I want every time you write something and read it out, you want it to sound natural. You want a lot of times when I work with people who are working on their scripts, if they read something to me and I say to them, does that sound like something you would ever say? Would you ever say those two sentences to me in actual conversation? If the answer is no, then we have to go back and rewrite, because you will be a better narrator if you write for your own voice. And not everybody is the same. That's something that took me a long time to learn. when I was a producer writing for other correspondents, each person had a different way of talking. Some people were fine with much longer sentences. Other people really struggled to get those out. And so you would use much smaller phrases, much more declarative sentences. I would use italics and underlines and bolds in the script to try to get them to understand what points to hit. So it's really important to be thinking about, how do I convey this information in as natural a way as possible? Because as I was mentioning before, I just don't think it's a good idea if people are wondering, who is that guy talking? Why does he sound so weird? Or he sounds kind of stilted, or he sounds like Anchorman, Ron Burgundy, that kind of thing. Like, be as much as you can yourself, be natural, and convey the information that your reporting has taught you. That's the, I keep saying this over and over again, but that is the goal. You've learned something, and now I'm going to tell you what I've learned, and you need to do that in a way that comes naturally out of you. And so writing and voiceovers go hand in hand. Like, you can hand me a script right now, and if it's not written the way that works for me, it's very difficult for me to do a good job with it. Very, very difficult. So stay simple.
Yeah, and so actually related to that, we have a great question from Grace. So Grace asks, how much voiceover is too much? Sometimes I feel like I am explaining too much in the beginning and not hearing enough from the interviewee.
It's a very good point. In fact, if you read a newspaper article and you just take a highlighter and highlight the number of quotes from people who are not the writer, you will see that the ratio is like 95% to 5%. 95% written, 5% from a person actually in the world. In TV, it's not the opposite, but it's much more closer to 50-50, or there really is no, to answer your question, hard and fast rule about this. If you worry that you're saying too much, you're probably saying too much. This is where having other people who don't know anything about what you're working on come and look at it. They're a good judge of that, because sometimes they can sit there and say, I don't understand, or why are you telling me all this now? I mean, it's not an easy, hard and fast rule for me to say, oh, if you're speaking, you as the narrator, 45% of the time in the first 3 minutes, that's too much. It's not. Sometimes you do have to explain a lot to get to where you're going. So there is no hard and fast rule, but I would argue it's really important. Strip out as much of that as you possibly can. Be spare. And then the best thing you can do is cut back. And then you'll start to realize, well, I have to know that this guy spent 24 years in prison before he starts talking about not having an ID. Like, there's certain things that you have to convey. Do that and then move along and spread some of that information out longer in the piece.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace, for that question. So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to make sure that we have time to chat with our student volunteers. So let's go through some of these slides really quickly. And you mentioned some of this already, William, about scripting. If we can go back to the previous one really quickly, because we had this example from other exercises that we've done at SRL, where sometimes it's good to mark up your script if that works for you, but you actually mentioned to me that you don't do that. So that's also something that it seems like, you know, you could do it, but if it doesn't work for you, you don't have to do it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this script, I can see here I don't know if you can all read this along, but I can see that someone is trying to put in the notation about, okay, hit positive body image is a big trend in fashion and media right now, but short guys seem to be left out. Like, you can see where all those pieces of punctuation. So for instance, if I'm writing my own script, I sort of know those intonations, so I don't necessarily feel the need to mark them. But if you're working with someone else, if you're the producer or you're a reporter and you're giving a script to another correspondent, sometimes you do want to convey that, and this kind of notation can be useful for that. So again, if you're writing your own words that you're going to speak, maybe you don't need those. If they're useful to you, that's great. Like, the last thing you want to do is distract yourself when you're narrating, because that's the hardest thing. If you've got a script in front of you, you're recording it, you want to try to make that that process flow as easily as possible. So whatever kind of notes work best for you, go for that.
Awesome. And then we also have some equipment tips. These are, again, things that we share with students within the SRL network. So it's so easy these days to record on your phone. And we can share the slides too for those interested in really looking into the settings on your phone and following these guidelines. But basically, you can just use your phone, set it up in the right way to maximize the audio that you get. And then we have some suggestions for audio recorders that are pretty cost effective. So feel free to look at those later too. And then for recording, so we have some more awesome photos that you've provided, William, of some of your recent setups. Can you talk a little bit about how you prepare your room to record a voiceover?
Yeah, so this was me recording in the house I used to live in, a podcast episode. And so I needed to both do a bunch of interviews with people in a quiet space. So what you see there, that picture on the left, is I basically made a 3-walled pillow wall around me, because pillows being nice and they sort of hold the sound in. And then on the left there, you see my microphone just sitting on top of the pillows. The picture on the right is the final version of that. That's me then sitting in the chair and pulling a big blanket over my head. I do this all the time. I'm in hotel rooms, I'm in rental cars. I've done these on boats, where I'm trying to create a space where the sound is the best it possibly can be. So you don't want to be in a big open room with an echo. You don't want to be in a place where you can hear a lot of noise or dogs barking or traffic, appliances making noise. And so sometimes the simplest thing to do is just to take a heavy down coat, a blanket, pull it over your head, and then, you're either looking at your phone or a computer screen in front of you. The hard part is, if you sit under a blanket for too long and it's sealed properly so that the sound is great, it gets really hot in there and you start to use up all the oxygen really quickly. And then so you start to get kind of desperate sounding, and that's not a great reaction. So I'm often, if I'm doing a long script under a blanket, I'll take 5-6 minutes under there, and then I'll flip it open and get some fresh air in there, because you don't want to be asphyxiating yourself. You're just trying to create the calmest, quietest place you can.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not easy.
No, it's not. Again, all of this is about creating a space where you can naturally talk like yourself. That is the whole goal. If I keep saying this, forgive me if I keep repeating myself, but so physically being in the right place, not running out of oxygen, not being in a place where you're going to be disturbed, all the things you can do to put yourself in the best position so that this is a natural process. As we said, it's a very unnatural thing to do, to record your voice and play it back. So do everything you can to give yourself the best chance of success for this. There's a couple of things here. A lot of people do warm-ups for their voices. I don't tend to do that. I mean, I know it's useful for a lot of people. I do find that sometimes shaking around and shaking my head back and forth and stretching my face out and making crazy sounds does get me, it sort of shakes off the rust a little bit and makes me feel like, okay, now I can talk like myself. The popping of the P's and the S's, that's what I was saying I use this little microphone for. If you only have something that's just this kind of a mic, if I say pizza, that's going to make a pop, pop, pop sound that you might hear. You don't want that sound coming through. Instead of having the mic pointing at you like this, sometimes if it's off to the side or there's a fabric or something like this to help stop that from happening. A lot of people do drink water when they're recording. There's something I learned of fascinating is that if your mouth makes a lot of smacking noises, people recommend eating applesauce, if you can believe this. I had never heard of this before, but people have these little kids, they give to little kiddos, little cup of applesauce, and a spoonful of applesauce in your mouth can sometimes help take that dry smacking sound that some people get.
Interesting. I never heard of that before.
I had never heard it either. When I saw a photograph of one of my colleagues recording and they had a big jar of applesauce, and I was like, what is that? You're giving her a snack in the recording booth? And she was like, no, it's for, I never knew. So
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I want to bring Abby up because we can actually go over some of these delivery tips too with her. So Abby, you brought a script with you, something that you did recently. So if you can share what that script is about, and yeah, and then we can have a conversation with William about it.
Okay, so the script that I recently wrote is for our MST program, for like our advanced classes. And so it stands for Math, Science, Technology. And it was just a short little commercial that I had to make to kind of sell the class to like our incoming students that, oh no, there's a puppy that might want to, you know, take the class and just they can get a feel for it. Okay. So the script goes, MST Math is an advanced class that can guide you to your fullest potential. Students in this class are very like-minded, and those who take this class are really taking a challenge upon themselves. MST classes provide after-school tutoring if you start to feel lost. So if you really like to push yourself, try MST Math. And Mr. Nectarline is a fun and goofy teacher guaranteed to make the experience fun.
Love that. Abby, that's so great. Thank you for sharing that. So can I ask you, how did you write that out? Did you have video shot for this already? What was the process by which you put that together?
Yeah, so we went in and we had to do two parts. We had to make a commercial, we had to interview. And so during the interview, I took mental notes on the students who were actually in the class and what they said about it and what the teacher said. Like the teacher was the one that said that a lot of the students are really like-minded, and I thought that was an important part to carry through since I couldn't really have that clip in the commercial. So I just kind of took mental notes on it of what they said and just wrote down like brief little spots that I could throw into the voiceover. That way it would all be as connected as how someone who's in the class could say it.
So you didn't have a written out script ahead of time?
No, I like to watch my video while I'm recording the voiceover. And of course I can do that as many times as I like. And I think it just comes out a little bit more naturally that way.
My gosh, Abby, you're like a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Is she's looking at the video as she's saying the words. I mean, you have even a little more courage than I do. I always feel like I need to write something down, but I know what that video is going to be. But a lot of times people do that. When I first started, people would go to these formal voiceover recording sessions where you'd be in a booth and there'd be an open window or a screen where the video of the documentary or whatever was playing, and then the person would record their narration while they were watching that. And I remember thinking like, wow, that seems awfully formal, but you're sort of doing that in a very natural sounding way. And again, I think you, by doing that, guarantee that you're not going to be saying things that don't make sense with the picture that you're showing. So I love the sound. I love the way you're describing the class. I love that you use fun and goofy to describe a teacher. Like, again, you don't feel the need to say, he has a PhD in microbiology and he will bring his knowledge and expertise to you, all the students. Like, you can say that he's fun and goofy because, one, you probably know him and know that he wouldn't mind being characterized that way. And that's also a selling point to students. Like, know your audience. Who are you talking to? The one thing I would encourage you to do as you're reading is to try to think of a little bit more slowing parts down, speeding other parts up. There was a similarity in the cadence as you were reading it. And again, I know that could be just because we put you on the spot and made you do this here, but think about slowing little bits for emphasis, speeding parts that you think are worth speeding over, and then having a little more fun even when you're talking about how fun and goofy he is. But those are great examples there, Abby. Thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, thank you. And so with the couple of minutes that we have left, I want to see if Paul can help us bring Capri, who's the second student from Hawaii, joining us with Erin. And Paul, if you can hear me, she is the dots that you had asked before. But I want to make sure that they have time to ask at least one question to William. So while we're getting Capri up here, Erin, can you share your question with William?
Question was, how do you know what you should write? Like, I know that some people have have a set format that they like to write the voiceover in. And what is your format towards writing voiceover?
Do you mean, Aaron, like what I use as an actual piece of software when I'm writing?
No, I mean like, cause like if you listen to your voiceover, it's kind of similar in the way that you like say your stuff. So how do you like figure out how you write your voiceover?
What I try to do is I often will, I'll write the words initially. Let's say I know what the picture is, that it's a bunch of penguins walking from the water up a beach. I'll write some of the narration, thinking about what those pictures will be, thinking I've got about maybe 8 to 10 seconds for this little bit of business. But then I will also read it out loud to myself. I'm constantly reading aloud as I write because I think it's a really good way of very quickly identifying what sounds right, what feels right, and what sounds natural coming out. Because honestly, I've had this experience before where I will write an entire script and not do that, not read it out to myself. And then I go in and I put the blanket over my head and I set up my recording setup and I start to read it, and then immediately I see the bits like, oh, that's too long of a sentence, and you can't take a breath in the middle of that, and why so many clauses? And so then I will start to rewrite there under the blanket, which is, again, it's natural, it happens, but you do a much better job if you read it to yourself aloud. And sometimes if you're first starting off, read it to someone else who doesn't know what you're talking about, your brother, your friend, your mom. Mom, does this make sense to say Gentoo penguins are the size of round footballs and they are waddling here from the beach up the hill? Like, does that make sense? Like, what are you going to be looking at when you see that? Does that sentence make sense to you? Do you wonder what that word Gentoo means? Like, so involve people, say it out loud, and just go through that process. And you'll find I find that my writing gets better and better that way.
Yeah, and I think one of the most valuable things that I've learned working in this field is that um, everything you write will be rewritten. Everything
Over and over again.
over and over again. Nothing you write for the first time, I mean, sometimes maybe, but usually it's not going to be the final draft. And that's okay because that's part of the creative process.
Totally, totally. And it's not something to take offense at, and it doesn't mean what you didn't do the first time was great. But there's a lot of reasons why you want to change things. Sometimes the picture doesn't work. Sometimes there's not enough picture to say an 8-second sentence. You've only got 4 seconds of video. So what are you going to do? Like, you're constantly needing to adjust.
Absolutely. Okay, Capri, do you have a question for William? I want to make sure to give you the last word. Can you hear me? Oh, there you go. Hi.
Do you have help while writing your script?
Do I have help? Hi, Capri. Thank you for talking with us. Do I have help? Meaning, like, do people come and help me? Yeah, always. I rely on others all the time. A lot of times I work in Google Docs, and so the producer, the associate producer, whomever is working on this story that I'm doing with me will be in the script together. So sometimes I'll take a first pass at writing it, and then they'll go in and they'll make comments, or sometimes they'll take a first pass at writing it and then I'll go in and try to make it sound more like me. But I think it's very, very difficult, especially when you're starting out, to just write something all alone and hope that that will be perfect, because you're trying to explain something to somebody else. And the beauty of this is that you get multiple chances to try to make it right before it has to be finished. So you get a friend, you get a parent, you get an older sibling or someone to say, let me read this to you. Does this make sense? And then you read it and you hear it come out of your mouth and you see their reaction to it. And that will teach you so much about how to be clearer, how to be more concise, and how to sound like you. So yeah, help is can't get by without help from your friends.
Good song. All right, well, we're at time. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I am leaving you here with just this last slide that it's always good to do your research and listen to voiceovers on all different kinds of shows, platforms, programs. There's tons of stuff out there right now, so I feel like there's just a limitless amount of things that you can learn from. And what's your favorite thing to listen to, William, or to watch?
I've been listening to a lot of scientific podcasts recently, and I love those. I love sometimes, because I work in television and video, it's sometimes I get a little overwhelmed watching so much TV, but to listen to just audio and the difference between not having a picture and listening to how those reporters and writers try to convey what they've learned and what they're experiencing and what they're hearing. I love that medium. So I've been listening to a ton of that recently.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, William. This has been an awesome
Thank you.
hour, 45
Thank you.
minutes. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Capri, for joining us. And thank you, everybody who was able to be here with us. So if you are looking to find out more information about Student Reporting Labs, go to studentreportinglabs.org. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of the STN convention. Congrats, everyone.
Yeah, good luck on your projects.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you
all
so
of our
much for being
panelists.
here.
Thank you.